So if we could just start by you saying your name, where you're born.
So my name's Brenda Kirsch. I grew up in Hackney in London in the 50s and 60s. I did a degree in the late 60s, and I started working from 1970 onwards. I worked in those days. If people said come and work for my outfit, you went and worked. No equal opportunities, no adverts. But this was a left wing. I knew people on the left, and there's an organisation that's just celebrated its 100th birthday called the Labour Research Department, which does research for trade unions and had been going since 1917. And I knew somebody through student politics who was working there and said, "Oh, we need researchers," and I just went along, and the guy in charge interviewed me, and sort of I was in. So but of course it was low paid, very low paid work, but very working for the cause, so I ended up working there about 8 or 9 years. I was a researcher. And I was asked to become editor of the monthly magazine, so that's how I got into journalism, through editing the magazine. But I also, the areas I specialised in was I used to keep tabs on the right, the extreme right, and employers' organisations that were seeking to blacklist workers. And I also kept records of political donations, which major companies and minor companies were supporting the Tory party. So, for example, I wrote a booklet on the National Front and that sort of thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that was published through
that organisation, yes. Actually, we got sued. That's another story. See, I can easily divert, but I won't divert. So.
You can divert.
No, somebody I named in the booklet on the National Front sued us for libel. And we settled out of court, and I'd made a mistake when I'd implied this guy who was at the time quite a well-known Second World War hero, and he was involved in various right-wing campaigns. I'd suggested that he'd put money behind the National Front. Of course, couldn't prove it. It was just the word on the street, So we settled out of court, but the very esteemed magazine Searchlight, which is still going, were a bit cross because they wanted us to go to court, so he would have to expose the source of it, whether he really did. It was just such a high risk strategy, and I couldn't, we couldn't really go with that. So I'd always been interested in sort of trying to expose and investigate how the state works and the right wing, and that had always been my area of interest.
And where was that office?
So that office is still there. It's in Blackfriars Road. Yeah.
And you stopped working there?
So I got a bit stressed out because it's pretty intense work, and of course those days before computers, producing a monthly magazine was quite hard work, so I left, and I did so I left in 82, and I got a temporary job working at a magazine called City Limits, because a journalist on there who you might have heard of called B. Campbell. She was very well known feminist and Marxist, and
yes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so she was taking a 6-month sabbatical to write a book. So she asked me, would I fill in for her?
I see.
So I worked on this magazine as a reporter for 6 months. And then parallel to that, I was very, very politically active. So in 1970 I joined the Communist Party, and I got very active in the Communist Party. And then when I worked at Labour Research Department, we were all members of a trade union, and I got involved in the trade union. In fact, I can't remember whether I was secretary of the branch or not. I just can't remember, but I was a delegate to the conference.
This is all in the Hackney branches?
No, this was... Sorry.
That's fine.
I grew up in Hackney, but oh, we're here. I went to Birmingham University for 2 years to do a degree, which I never actually completed, but when I came back from Birmingham, I shared a flat with friends in Clapham. So I was very active politically in Lambeth, which is this borough, and because of my involvement with the trade union branch, I then became involved in Lambeth Trades Council, which is, I don't know whether, they don't really exist, but there used to be borough-based committees of all the unions that had branches in that borough would get together and discuss trade union matters.
Okay.
So I became very involved. In fact, I definitely was. I think I was chair of the Lambeth Trade Union Council for quite a number of years. And through my involvement with that, I'd been very interested in anti-racist activity. And I've been involved in all sorts of anti-racist committees. When I came back to London from Birmingham, I set up a Free Angela Davis committee in Lambeth, all white people. Anti-racist movement, all white people. So there was like a white left anti-racist movement, sort of parallel to what was going on in the black community. So I know these days some people looking back on that regard us as being racist.
Maybe just feed it through the underneath and then round.
Oh, I'll tell you what, yeah. Oh, that'll do, yeah. Yeah, I know there is one interpretation at the time is that we were racist, but we were sort of well-intentioned white people. We weren't actually being hostile, squeezing out black people. It's just we were in our own little white bubble, right? So I was very inspired by Angela Davis, who was a black American communist, but in the USA, the Communist Party had a completely different relationship to the black community, different history and so on. Anyway, so I was involved in anti-racist groups, mainly white, and there was a growing concern about policing of the black community, of young black men, and the use of the sus law, and the numbers of young black men in police custody. Stoke Newington police station in the 70s, something like 3 or 4 young black men had actually died in the police station. And in the Lambeth Trade Union Council, although we were largely overwhelmingly a white group, and the Lambeth Council had a few black representatives, but not very many. But the council, I can't remember how it emerged, but the council set up an inquiry into community police relations in Lambeth, and I was the nominee from the Trades Council to sit on that. So that was at the time that the left in Labour were getting into positions of power in various local authorities. And it was about the time, just before Ken Livingstone won the GLC for Labour, but there were, Lambeth, Hackney, Sheffield, all over the country, Liverpool, there were left Labour groups getting in. So this was very much part of the agenda. So I sat on this committee which produced this report, which came out in it came out in January 1981, and we warned there would be trouble, and then 2 months later the Brixton riots broke out. So so that indicated that the problem was there.
So who that was published by the trade unions?
No, this was published by London Borough of Lambeth.
Okay.
It was an official Lambeth publication, and the committee of inquiry this was our committee of inquiry. It included a well-known barrister, councillors, and only one black person. Oh, actually, was Tony Bays might have been a black councillor, but Amrit Wilson was quite a well-known Asian origin writer.
Yeah.
So it indicates there was sort of limited how at that time the Labour movement really had very little involvement from the black community, and there were parallel black community associations which we didn't really connect with, apart from a sort of rather patronising. Oh yes, well they're doing a good job.
So how do you feel about that kind of then and now?
I think it was part of a historic moment. So I mean now it wouldn't happen like that. Now if a council set up a committee looking into police relations in a multicultural borough, that wouldn't be a mainly white body. It would be a multicultural body, and it would have representatives from the diverse groups. So there were diverse groups there, but they were sort of under the radar of the left and the Labour movement at the time. So there was like a above the line and below the line, and I suppose also there was a sense in which black communities were isolated from civil society. That there were active groups. I mean, there were quite a few active black people in the Communist Party, but they were groups of Jamaicans or West Africans or Indians who were going back home to fight colonialism, So so I think you have to really judge that was part of the historic moment. But one of the things that came out of that, parallel to this, I also then got involved in something called there was a movement certainly around London, to set up police monitoring groups. So I was in the Lambeth Police Monitoring Group, again overwhelmingly white, and we were sort of keeping a watch on what the police were doing and reporting things. But we were quite limited because it was sort of mainly we didn't really understand and appreciate the extent to which police racism. I mean, we knew about it theoretically. We knew that we could see all the figures that the police stopped young black men disproportionately under sus, and then there was a process of criminalisation because it just stopped on the streets, got into an argy-bargy of protests as anybody would, and then get arrested for no reason other than standing up for themselves. But because I think we thought those black youth were individual and unorganised, so we didn't know how to make contact with them. But there were black community groups in Lambeth that were growing. So anyway, I was involved in that. So getting back to my work situation, the GLC in 1981 elected a Labour council, which then exercised a sort of coup, and Ken Livingstone became leader, and then that engendered what then became the sort of the GLC period.
How did that feel to kind of see the Labour politicians get key seats in those areas you described before, like at the time watching it kind of happen?
Oh, it's very, very good, because the GLC had been run from by rather pompous Tory individuals. It just seemed very remote, and it seemed like it would always be Tory controlled, and like it had no purchase. It didn't bear any relationship to what was going on the ground. So although the GLC had lots of powers because it ran London Transport, it built houses, there are GLC housing estates all over the place. It actually, there was a London Police Committee. There wasn't that wasn't part of the GLC, but there were, and then it funded Covent Garden and Sadler's Wells, and that was basically what it was doing. So now I should explain that being in the Communist Party, I felt that a lot of the people in the Labour Party making grounds were what I would call leftists. That I thought they were too left for me, and they're very often tied in with groups like Militant, and there were various interest groups. There were loads of groups on the left, IMG and SLL and the SWP, and in fact we often used to there was a pub in Brixton we all used to drink in the same pub, White Left. This is White Left. There were pubs around the corner, sort of Cold Harbour Lane, that were black pubs, but the White Left drunk in the railway, now closed down.
That was the name of the
yeah. So we drank there. So we knew each other, and we used to get into political rows with them. And I just thought I had a different perspective on moving forward, and I always used to think that the militant group and some were too out of touch with people's day-to-day lives. But so when those sort of people started winning positions in Labour councils, I was always slightly critical. So because I thought, they're off on their own agenda. But there was obviously what was different. So although I associated Ken Livingstone with that sort of position on the left, at some point, I'm not quite sure when, but he realised that there was outside of so those people were battling in the Labour Party, but meanwhile outside the Labour Party there were all these new groups growing up. There was the women's movement, there was the gay movement, there were people involved in agitprop theatre, there were all sorts of things going on. And, Ken must have had this light bulb moment, and he suddenly thought, forget about the Labour Party the right-wing Labour Party leadership, let's get all these people on board. So at some point they reached out to a much wider constituency, and that's what made it interesting. And
roughly when?
So, it must have been from about 81, 82. About 81, 82, they started reaching out. Some of these groups were their mates, right? So one of the things they set up was they set up a subcommittee of the GLC called the Police Committee to actually monitor the police, because at that time there wasn't a police authority that was overseeing the Metropolitan Police. So they set up this committee, which was made up of Tories and Labour and so on, and they decided that they would have a unit of people working in the council that would monitor and produce factual evidence and information. And I should say, so they set up the Police Committee Support Unit. Now, one of the reasons they did that was there was a very dynamic individual called Tony Bunyan, who had been involved in this area for a long time, and he knew lots of people on the left, and he'd been involved in campaigns around Ireland, because of course there's occupation of Ireland going on, and a few years previously in the 70s, Tony had set up something called State Research, which was a voluntary group of people, a bit like Labour Research, but there's a voluntary group of people who were monitoring the state, a bit like early sort of Edward Snowden type things, but before the computers. And I was invited to be a member of this group. So State Research...
is what is now called State Watch.
It's now called State Watch.
That's Tony who runs State Watch.
That's right, so you know Tony.
My friend has worked with him.
Well, Tony, he's a key person to interview.
My friend is really...
Yeah, Tony is a key person to interview because he was in there right from the start. So Tony set up this voluntary group, and we published a regular magazine, and we published a monthly magazine and bulletin sheets, and we had premises in Poland Street. There was a trust that was set up by somebody involved with the Liberal Party or the Quakers that actually had a building that was loads of leftist community groups in there. So Tony had been instrumental in setting up State Watch. That was like an annual publication, and he was then well known enough to be. He must have applied for. They must have set it up with him in mind. I don't know. Tony will. I wasn't in, and I can't remember all of that. So they set up this committee, and then a job came up, which was to be publications manager. So I applied for the job, and that was a proper job application. But I was interviewed by people who I knew on the outside. So that's how I got to work at the GLC. So I went to work. So I went there in February 1983, and I was full-time publications and information officer, I think I was. And then parallel to that, because I was also still very politically active, I was very involved in the Communist Party. I was like quite a senior member of the Communist Party, and there were things going on in the Communist Party. One of the things that was going on was that there was a split in the. I know this might sound. This is just to explain. I told you I do get a bit long-winded.
No, this is actually
so there was a split in the Communist Party around basically people who were what I'd call Stalinists and people who were more democratic socialists. And as a result of this split was centred around what had been the Communist Party daily paper, the Morning Star, which is still going. But there was the people who controlled the Morning Star disagreed with the direction that the Communist Party was taking. So basically there was a parting of the ways. And because the Communist Party lost the Morning Star, it set up its own newspaper as a communication measure. So when it set up its own newspaper, which was a weekly paper and then fortnightly paper, I then applied and I became deputy editor of that. And what I did was I changed my position at the GLC Police Committee Support Unit. I went down from full-time to part-time, and I used to work 1 week on, 1 week off. So 1 week I'd work at the GLC, and then 1 week I'd work on the newspaper 7 days and help to produce that week's issue. And then, so
very busy. So
that was, yeah. How did I do all these things? I don't know. So, but I was still publications officer there, and so my job was I used to edit something called Policing London. Of course, I don't have a single copy of that to show you. This is some other ephemera. I'll come on to this. This is a publication that came out towards the end, a bit grubby, which I edited. It was written by the researchers there, but sort of a guide to the Metropolitan Police, which the police themselves said was very useful, very handy guide. And so we were monitoring the police and so on, and I was the publications editor. Then the GLC was abolished in March 86, and a number of the support units then went on to were funded by a number of Labour London boroughs to become something called the London Strategic Policy Unit. So basically the GLC was abolished politically, but our work went on in a more limited way. But the money, that only lasted for 2 years, because this was all just after rate capping, and there'd been...
After what, sorry?
Rate capping. There'd been a big Tory push to stop the leftward trend in Labour councils. So the Tory government introduced this limit to how much money councils could spend on things like funding black community groups and doing this sort of research. So there was a whole battle going on there, basically between the Thatcher government and left Labour councils at that period, the abolition of the GLC was completely political. That was a completely political act by Thatcher, because she didn't like the politics, and she was prepared to destroy a layer of democracy. Although, having said that, before Ken Livingstone was leader, the GLC did appear to people to be like an unnecessary layer, because we had borough councils, so why did we have to put all this money into the GLC? And then during the Livingstone period, it became clear that the GLC did have this potential to make quite a lot of strategic change at a London-wide level, which you couldn't do at borough, just on the borough level.
Who would you say that became clear to? Is that it became clearer to the wider public that it could have this impact? Or
yeah, so I just was reading, because I told you in advance my memory was so poor, but I just so Ken Livingstone introduced the fair's fair policy, which is the most fantastically popular thing. And it immediately, because it just reduced the fares. Like, the fares suddenly become affordable. Instead of going up every year, there was a cap and limit, and there's a freeze on fares, and just make travelling around London was just so much easier. And then, in addition to that, there were all these other funding of other groups and organisations, and an attempt to set a strategy for the economy at London level, for employment. Loads of things were coming up, and of course this was then seen as a focus of opposition to the Thatcher government, because it was like it was London, but there were other local authorities were attempting to do this in the wake of what what Ken Livingstone was doing. Was that it was possible to operate alternative, like Princeton's, like little city states. So London became like its own city state within, and of course Thatcher found that completely objectionable.
Do you know what the feeling was like when the abolition was kind of nearing, and when people could kind of tell this was coming?
Oh, people were very opposed to it. Yeah, there was huge reaction in London against it. Huge reaction, and there was festivals and demonstrations. There was huge reaction, but in the same way that this was only a year after the miners' strike. You have to all these things have to be read together. So she felt confident that she defeated the miners. The miners had been on strike for 2 years. They were crushed by the policing strategy, which incidentally was something else that we did. I went up to Yorkshire and I observed picket lines and magistrate courts and things like that. So we were keeping tabs on what was happening.
And you were doing that through the subcommittee?
Through the support unit, yes, because the our justification for that was that the Metropolitan Police were being sent up to Yorkshire to police the striking miners. So we were monitoring what the Metropolitan Police were doing. So we had complete right to continue. Our brief then extended up there, as well, because that's what the Metropolitan Police were doing.
And you yourself there were there on more than one occasion?
I had been up there privately, but on behalf of the GLC, I was up there for a week with a colleague, and wow. we presented a report to the committee and that sort of thing.
How did that feel? Being there and recording it and.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I'd seen the police in action because as you might guess, through the 70s and 80s, I'd been on my fair share of demonstrations. I was on demonstrations like every weekend. So I'd seen the police in action, but it was the magistrates' courts that were absolutely shocking, just prosecuting people for nothing, It was just so obviously a stitch-up, so obvious, so much for the neutral state and, the independence of the judiciary. It was so, well, of course it wasn't, because magistrates, who are the magistrates? The magistrates are, retired councillors and retired local businessmen and so they're not, the magistrates, it's changed a bit now, but their magistrates were definitely not representative of the community. Yes. So just as a couple of examples of what we did. So we were presenting reports to the committee on various things, but also we were reaching out as well. So one of the things we did was we released an LP, a single actually, called 1982. There was a new police bill that was proposed. So one of the things that the police committee majority was very critical of this police bill, and so the support unit was briefed with investigating what was in the bill and raising awareness of it. So we had a young man who worked with us. I should say at this stage, the police committee support unit was much more racially diverse than the anti-racist groups I'd been talking about previously. So we actually did have a number of prominent, we had a couple of black lawyers and researchers working with us. And we had this young man who was very interested in, he must have been a DJ, I think he was a DJ on the side. So he suggested we release a reggae number against the bill. So what we did was this was outside, this wasn't my brief, this was his brief. So he got together with a reggae group and they cut a vinyl, and they had a gig at the Brixton Academy called the Kill the Bill gig. And so that was another way of reaching out to people. Now, as it happens, I think there must have been a general election was called in February 1983, and the bill was dropped. So the bill wasn't killed. The bill just sort of evaporated.
What was the name of the bill?
The police bill. Yeah. So I think it must have come back in a different form somewhere else. But so that was one example of outreach work, and then another one was I knew somebody who was involved with an alternative film production company, and they had gone to various parts of the GLC and suggested producing videos to actually reach out to more people in London about the work of the GLC. So, so basically going outside this sort of boring committee paper report type structure. So they made a 30-minute video called Policing London, which was it was semi-fiction and it was a mixture of fiction and interviews. So we had what was quite a well-known actor who I don't think ever worked again after he appeared in our film, called David Yip. There was years ago, before your time, there was a TV programme called The Chinese Detective, and he was in that. But so it was a mixed. So they play. The two actors play reporters investigating London's police, and so it's fictional, but they also talk to real people, including Paul Brayton and so. So that was also, an attempt to.
What was the kind of working process in making that film with them? You were giving them information and research, and
they did research with. They talked to all of us. It was the film company who did. I'm not quite sure. It must have been Maxim. Yeah.
That's the name of the film.
Maxim Ford. He's now died actually. And Benjamin Zephaniah did. He must have done a special poem actually. Guido Gasale, who did the script. Yeah, so the people from the production company came and interviewed people, and they looked through our material, and they came up with this script. And then I think Tony Bundy must have worked on agreeing the final script and so on, or rather the police committee. Well, Paul Brotang would have done, but Tony would have been effectively the person who agreed it. And so it's just different ways of reaching out to people, and that was and the other thing that our committee did, like a lot of the other committees, was fund local monitoring groups and local projects, and we did things like fund. I don't know whether you've heard of film director Julian Isaacs. Julian Isaacs. Sorry, I've completely forgotten his name. But he went on to become quite a well-known director, and our committee funded a film project of his, on the basis that it had a police investigating content to it, and therefore was valid. Isaac. God, sorry.
Do you remember the name of the film?
I can look that up. I can't remember. It'd be in his. In a bit, I'll just double check his name, and it'll be in his filmography. Yeah.
And the local monitoring groups. Do you remember some of them? And
Southall Black Sisters. Do you know Umesh Desai? He then went on to become a Labour councillor in Newham, and he ran something called the Newham Monitoring Project. There was the gay and lesbian police observation group Gallup, and there were various Irish groups. I should say quite a few of the people who've been involved in state research had links with groups in Ireland, and the Troops Out movement, which became the month before I started work. There was a big hoo-ha, which came as being repeated in all the bashing of Jeremy Corbyn about the GLC inviting Sinn Féin to London, and in fact Ken Livingstone met Gerry Adams and so on. But the thing that really needled the Evening Standard and the right-wing press was that we gave money to the Troops Out movement for specific projects about policing of Irish protest and so on.
So your committee gave money to the Troops Out organisation to do their own research into the troops.
Yeah, well, because it was various. I'd have to double check on that, but I think that happened before I started work there. But I think that was one source of funding. But Tony would definitely remember that. There's some things I just can't quite remember.
And you said the right-wing press were quite
hostile to that. Oh yeah.
And do you remember the press in general, whilst you were there at the GLC, what the kind of relationship was? Were they antagonistic?
Well, it's like it's always been. You know, the Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph are always going to be antagonistic, and because the Guardian had a more critical, always had a more critical stance, so it was always like more favourable to us. But we did lots of reports and publications that were quite central. I mean, we weren't just doing crazy extreme things. I mean, these were to do with, you know, really valid things that affected Londoners. You know, like people with mental health issues being taken into police custody. You know, just there were loads of very valid issues that couldn't be dismissed as, you know, leftist. Yeah.
And how did you find working alongside the police? How did the relationship with the police kind of?
Well, we weren't working alongside the police, so we were critical observers of the police. But I, on a personal level, I did attempt to make contact with some progressive people in the police, because there were, even at this time, there was a quite a well-known police chief constable called John Alderson, who was from the Devon and Cornwall Constabulary, and he was much more like on the Guardian wing of the police. And there was a debate going on within the police as to whether you police by consent or police by control. And where we came in, you know, from the police monitoring groups and State Watch, State Research and so on, was that we were trying to expose policing by control, and there was another way to police. So, for example, on a more sort of an example of a mainstream approach, I remember I think in the last year of the GLC, I remember having a discussion with Paul Boateng, who was the chair of the committee and so on. And one of the things that was coming up was that whilst the police were busy spending resources on picking up young black men in Brixton, meanwhile it wasn't investigating burglaries and crimes and robberies and so on. So we decided it was important to also call on the police to devote resources to protecting communities from crime. So it wasn't just protecting the state from, you know, minors striking and so on, but so we came up with this concept of community safety, which is now is like completely acceptable, but it was something that was in the wind. So there used to be, it was a development of something that the police always had a programme on crime prevention, which was, you know, how you look after yourself and prevent crime. And so community safety was taking this further, because community safety was about how to build safe communities, and part of it was the police actually had to engage with communities and get the confidence of communities. So that was quite a mainstream approach. So on a personal level, on the side, was getting back to my involvement in the Communist Party. We used to run an annual event called the Communist University of London, which was a week of debate over. It was originally academic subjects, but then it became all sorts of political issues, a whole range of things. And I think two or 3 years running, I was working on a module which was looking at policing, and I managed to get people from within the police or ex-police officers to come along and speak to us. So that was quite interesting. So there was, you know, there were always even with all this going on in the Met Police, there were always elements in the police who were very worried about a lot of these developments.
How was so they came and spoke at the university, at the
Yeah, it was just a couple of meetings that I organised. It was nothing. I wouldn't like make a big song and dance about it, but it was just an example that there were people involved in the police who were aware and worried about some of the developments taking place. Yeah.
And what would you say were some of the most like important or memorable kind of accomplishments or successes or moments for you in the committee and through the committee?
Well, I think on a general level, all through the time of the committee and the support unit, there were a number of campaigns of injustice that we always campaigned for, and every single one of them has since been proved to be correct. So particularly the Guildford 4 campaign and Birmingham 7, I think it was. There were and then the miners' strike. I think it's accepted now that there were in fact, what happened was all those miners who got arrested during the strike a year later, none of their cases came to fruition. So it's just there are other issues which I've forgotten, but there was a consistency about championing injustices, and I would say definitely people like Tony Bunyan and the other researchers were very strong about pushing these things. Sorry, I should have said obviously the when you get to a certain age, your brain just fades.
Absolutely.
The demonstration in Ireland where 13 people got killed. Bloody Sunday, yeah. So thank you. So they were all causes that since have been proved to be injustices, and at the time particularly Tony and the other researchers and the people from the committee were arguing very strongly, no, we insist, these have to be investigated. So
did that feel kind of strenuous, being in the GLC and supporting these campaigns, which is kind of like very less formal and official, and
well, I suppose because everybody everybody was aware there were injustices. It was quite a long time ago, and it's not just politics that changes, but the framework around information. So a lot of what we were doing was exposing information which would otherwise have lay buried away, and so of course now with Wikipedia and so on, there's a whole different relationship to information, some of which is negative as well as positive, but certainly at that time just reporting on what was happening in itself was quite an achievement, really. And just to say this anti-racist demonstration at New Cross Gate, the police just smashed in with their truncheons, and it was wrong. Why did they do that? And it was vindictive. It was just reporting the facts. And I think state research was very much like, in Labour research, although we were partisan, we felt that let the facts speak for themselves. And what I think Tony's approach with state research was the same. Just get the facts, let the facts speak for themselves. So that was very much, and then of course you then have credibility as a researcher and what you produce. This is why I was also slightly critical of some groups on the left who I thought were bashing people over the head with positions, and you always need to have an evidence base to justify what you're saying, and this is what we were doing, was having an evidence base, really. So I think that was all very good. Yeah.
How did it feel for you, like I'm just thinking about myself as well and other people, but like at that time to be like in the Communist Party and in the GLC and around other groups, like how did that feel in terms of the kind of different spheres to be moving between them? And
yeah, but I think the overwhelming thing was we all felt we were all part of the same opposition, and we felt besieged by Thatcherism, and not just besieged by Thatcherism, but at the time there was so much going on, women's movement, gay movement, lesbian, Irish people's movement, there was just so much, there were so many things happening and developing and emerging, so it was quite exciting, really.
Was there any one of those things that you kind of distinctly remember feeling inspired by, or something that happened in them, the different emerging movements?
I can't actually give a straight answer to that, because I felt like I was so involved in so many different things. And also what was going on in the Communist Party at the same time was like a whole other parallel story to what was going on, which sort of rather, detracted me because I was so involved in that. I got a bit sidelined by that. I was well, no, I wasn't. I was sidelined, but on the other hand, I got together with like-minded people, and I was very influenced by the Euro-communist approach, which in its turn was influenced by Gramsci, and I very much was very much influenced by the sort of the Gramscian approach to the importance of culture. Generally, the importance of ideas and ideology, the importance of working across different groups, sometimes working with people that aren't necessarily our political friends, but in order to advance that, this is what you do. So for me, it was that sort of politics of I suppose a lot of what Ken Livingstone was doing in the GLC had that sort of approach, but it also there were negative undertones as well. But so I think it was that general breadth of people coming together from shared interest, and I think the way for me it was the way the GLC brought together people who were working on employment and domestic violence and black culture, and it's just everything coming together like that. So I think that was the main thing, and there have been legacies as well. I mean, I think this is the thing I think in that meeting, when I first mentioned to Debs and others about the GLC, I said, did you know that until Ken Livingstone came along, the Royal Festival Hall was locked up all day?
Wow.
And he came along and he unlocked it, and you could just walk in there. You didn't have to buy a fancy ticket for a fancy concert. And the next thing you know, there's cafes and bars, and we used to go there for our lunch. Before then, it was just like completely closed off, and it was that opening up of public space. That's quite an important legacy.
Do you think that brought with it a kind of mood?
Yeah, people felt confident. People felt like this belongs to us. It's not, because there's the Arts Council. Up until the GLC came along, the Arts Council had millions of pounds of public money, which it just met I think once a year, and it gave so much to Covent Garden, so much to Settlers Wells, so much to the South Bank, and and it was all like locked up, closed, elite culture. And by opening up the doors and then having steel bands playing in there and all sorts of music, it made a difference. How's your sound system going?
Good.
Yeah, okay. There are an enormous number of planes going across today.
And do you remember the kind of theme years? There was thematic years.
Oh gosh,
Like
I've forgotten
the
about them. Remind me.
Peace year, anti-racism year,
Oh
jobs
gosh.
for a change.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah.
I don't remember anything. I don't know anything. Could you tell me a bit about them?
I can't remember much, but they were themed years with money going into projects and exhibitions and displays and of course organisations that were getting grants from the GLC. I think they could bid in for special projects for those years. Yeah, so it probably was a way of encouraging people to come forward.
And how many people were actually how many people were you working with in your committee? I mean, you
so there's the committee were the councillors who met once a month to decide on policy, and I was on the police committee support unit. So there'd be something like 12 to this one. I've got a list here from 1985, and it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It'd be about 16 researchers plus about 5 admin people. So say 20 to 25 people working there. And everybody had, those included researchers, lawyers. We had a couple of legally qualified people because, of course, to go through the bills and legislation. And then people were liaising with groups who were applying for grants and funding, so on. But I should say one of the things that I was particularly keen on, the GLC was one of the best places I've worked at in terms of employment practices, and 2 things on that. Now I don't know whether this predated the Ken Livingstone GLC, but I think probably not. But they had fantastically good training opportunities for staff, and they had really good training programs. And in fact, I went on a training program, and then as a result of that, I was invited to actually be a tutor on further training programs. And that was a training program about diversity, I think equality and diversity. And they were like for all grades of staff, and they really did encourage staff to get involved. And one little thing that I did before the end was I was given an admin assistant, and it was just in the months before the GLC was abolished. So before we were abolished, I made sure that she got regraded and she got onto a higher salary. So it meant when she left, she actually could apply for jobs from a slightly higher grade. So I was quite pleased with that. But the GLC was very good with involving its own staff in this project as well. Yeah.
So would you say that the GLC was kind of like creating the alternative within itself that it wanted to see outside of itself as well?
Yeah, I think it was setting very high standards. I think it was setting high standards for employment. I mean, it's a huge place. I mean, thousands of people work there. That's why Thatcher wanted to abolish it. She said it was too expensive. It did. I mean, it traditionally had done a whole load of things. I mean, I knew people who'd worked there from before as architects and so on, and I think it had a good reputation as a workplace before, but I think during this period there was much more encouragement of staff at all levels to get involved in their own staff development and so on. I must say it was the best paid job I've ever had. So this table was sitting at, I never owned a table till I worked at the GLC, and with the money I earned, I went to Habitat and I bought this table and these chairs. So that's 40 years old. So.
They look very sturdy. So it must have been good money.
Yeah.
There was a lot of people working there. Well, actually, first thing I wanted to ask is, so you said there was kind of like demonstrations and people were upset about the nearing abolition of the GLC, but at the same time, you said Thatcher was putting out that it was too expensive and it was cumbersome. What was the kind of public response? Do you remember it being quite split, or was it generally that London did not want this thing to end?
No, I think it was an attack on London, and I think it was seen as that, and because people were worried about, because the fair policy had been so popular, so what's going to happen to the fares, because up until then every year the fares had gone up like 5%, 10%, travelling around London was really expensive, and so I think ordinary Londoners were very worried about that. And then things like the GLC also had a role. The GLC had a certain amount of housing that it built, so that all went. Then, of course, there was a tricky relationship with the ILEA, so the Inner London Education Authority still continued. And that had incorporated a lot of the sort of equal opportunities policies from the GLC. And then the all the cultural stuff, because wasn't just opening up Festival Hall. I mean, the GLC funded loads of free festivals all over the place. And, on the South Bank there'd be Jubilee Gardens, there'd be concerts and so on going on. So it was all of that. That was all really popular stuff. So we, the people who worked at the GLC, we had a number of one-day strikes, but they sort of we all got worn out by the end, really. Yeah.
Fatigued.
Yeah.
And did the team around you and the kind of larger team, did it feel like a kind of community? Was there a kind of sense of coming together and getting to know each other? And also the thing is, I've been made redundant in jobs, but when the whole organisation's abolished, it's a slightly different thing, because like everybody's going. That's like, I can't remember how many thousands of people lost their jobs, but that's a huge thing. It was very, very sad. It was very sad. Tears were shed and so on. Yeah. And you're kind of like your immediate community, your friends and family. What do they think about the GLC and you being at the GLC? If you remember.
I can't really remember. I did write because I was working for this paper called 7 Days. I was writing an occasional column about the last months about GLC. I remember I wrote a column once saying, can tell it's getting near the end. When I went into my office this week, my chair had gone. I don't even have a chair to sit on and so on. And somebody criticised me. Somebody said I was whinging, and I was just trying to be amusing about, this is how things are going. So, but because a whole load of us went off to the London Strategic Policy Unit, so there was a community of us which did stay together for 2 years afterwards, but on reduced funding, and it was, limits to what we could do, and it was. It was a sort of token thing. I mean, it kept us going for a couple of years, but it was a sort of bit of a token thing. We tried to do our best with producing material and so on.
What do you feel were there any downsides to the GLC? Do you think that it kind of was not doing as well as it could have in certain fields, or do you think it actually was negative in any respects?
I think it had some effects, sort of unintended consequences. So, although it was very positive that local community groups were given grants to operate, it became clear to me during this process that groups were then becoming dependent on grants and were becoming little employment organisations, whereas they'd originally been set up as community, activist groups. So I felt there were some organisations which maybe were beginning to lose touch with their community base because they then became funded to employ people and so on. And then I think that caused some problems, because if you then belong to a community group and you're not funded, you're at odds. You can be at odds with groups that are funded.
Have you got any specific examples?
No, I won't. I can't. I just remember. This is a bit of an off the wall example, but because there were so many organisations that were funded, they could then afford to pay full rates for various things. So this is like a completely random example which sticks in my mind, but sometime during this period I went to Turkey through the Communist Party to observe a military trial, because at that stage Turkey hadn't become a democracy, it was a military dictatorship. And when I was in Turkey, I made contact with some women who'd formed a women's organisation, and it was all clandestine. And I went to the first ever women's movement conference in Istanbul, and I went to a flat that women used to come together. And when I came, they were desperate for contact with feminists from other countries. So when I came back, I bought them a subscription to Spare Rib, which was the feminist magazine. And then after a year, I got a renewal subscription from Spare Rib, and they wanted me to pay like £140 subscription instead of like £10. So when I queried this, I said, they said, well, it's for this women's organisation in Istanbul, so we charge an institutional rate. So that's just a little example. So meanwhile, like women's groups throughout London that were funded by the GLC could afford to pay us a higher subscription to community magazine like Spare Rib, who then were becoming dependent on this higher income from groups funded from the GLC. So it's like a further down the food chain, fish were getting bigger, you know. And I tried to explain to the subscription department, but this is an illegal group. They're meeting clandestinely in a secret flat, and I'm just doing this as a personal favour to them. And they said, oh no, it's an institutional rate. So it's just that sort of, it's a bit of a wacky example, but it's like there was a mindset that, you know, there was a sort of, it almost became like a bureaucratic approach that some people had. But that was very much of the time.
do you feel that might have had a knock-on effect on how people organise in the communities?
Yeah, I think so, because I think I've got no evidence for this, but I think because a lot of groups were funded and became professional, I think there might have been a period of a few years when people forgot how to organise as an unfunded voluntary community group. People lost the habit of how you then organise. So a lot of these groups then converted into being professional organisations and got funding from elsewhere and kept going. I mean, there were obviously things like, you know, Rape Crisis Centre and so on that hadn't existed, and group organisations like the GLC helped to fund them, and it became obvious that these groups needed funding. But I think there were probably lots of other smaller community groups that just fell by the wayside because they didn't actually have a sustainable base. You've got to have a base, and so I think so that's my criticism, that some organisations were funded from the top and they didn't have the backing from below to sustain them. Yeah, so getting back to the film director is Isaac Julian, and he the GLC funded him to make a film about the death of Colin Roach, which was a notorious case in '83. And I was going to say, just looking at that online reminded me that one of the important organisations that we funded was Inquest, which is gone, and actually that was one woman, Deborah Coles. Might be worth you interviewing her. So although she never worked at the GLC, she was funded through the GLC, and she's also been one of these like stalwart one-person campaigners who she works on every area of deaths in custody, whether it's police or prisons, and that's been a very she's run a very good campaign all those years.
So Inquest kind of got started through funding from the GLC, or had it started?
I think it must have started before. It must have started before, but it certainly got some funding from us. Yeah.
And kind of, you still live in London. What would you say are the kind of very clear legacies of the GLC?
Well, I'd certainly say this South Bank being open. I think that is definitely, that's probably, for me, that's a really visible thing. A lot has disappeared. I mean, there's obviously a lot of memory about, I think it's, there's tangible and intangible. So the fact that Festival Hall is open is tangible, but the intangibles, I think, are to do with ways of working and inclusivity, and factors like organising a rock festival or an event in a free event in a park can be political. They aren't just entertainment, that you can actually bring together culture and politics in order to enlighten and enrich people's lives and make them think about things. Yes, I think, you know, festivals in parks with loads of stalls from loads of organisations. I mean, that's a big thing. And there were a lot of really interesting people involved in that project. I think it was Ken Livingstone's finest hour. I don't think he's ever, even when he was Mayor of London more recently, I do think the GLC was his finest hour, but I think that was mainly because he was part of a community of people. I think it was that coming together of people working in a whole number of different areas, you know, from education to housing and culture. And then different communities, black communities, ethnic minorities, women's organisations. I mean, I think all those, that coming together has helped define the sort of London day-to-day London culture now. But they are intangible. They're sort of they are legacies. Yeah. And my table and chairs, of course.
Definitely, they have a long legacy. Why do you feel that because to a large extent, a lot of young people, for example, don't really know or remember the GLC. Why do you think that the legacy kind of lost lost its traction, or do you think there was a kind of active?
I think it's because a lot of what was pioneering in 1983 is just accepted as day-to-day things now. I think you just accept festivals in parks now. The fact you can walk into the festival hall and have a meeting, and it's just part of daily life. There are other political things which I think a lot of young people, I'm very critical of this attempts to drive generations against each other, and I think there's ways in which some younger people don't understand what some people of my generation actually pioneered and struggled and went through, because it just seems ridiculous to, some of the areas we battled on just seem absolutely ridiculous. Like, as a woman walking into a pub and not being able to buy a pint of beer because the pub would only let you have a half a pint of beer. So, it just seems completely absurd thing to say that you were campaigning around things like this, And the other thing is that the makeup of London has changed very considerably, and that's made quite a difference. So, and this is something I think I mentioned to Debs and Natasha once before, was at the time, 1981, 82, and so on, Ireland was such a significant factor in our daily lives, because there was an occupation of Northern Ireland, there was a war going on, there were terrorist events all the time. Thousands of people in London got killed through quite a long period, and there was there was an identifiable Irish community in London who felt besieged in a way that there isn't now. So, there were like first and second generation Irish communities in Kilburn and Brent and so on who felt really isolated and got at within this context. Whereas now, then you went through a period of the late 80s when the biggest ethnic minority communities in London were were Caribbean and Asian. And not even you didn't even have that many African communities in London, let alone European communities. So, and there was a point, I remember writing a report on immigration in 1991, where immigration had basically levelled off. There'd been a high, well, partly there were immigration acts and nationality law, so there'd been through the 50s and 60s, there'd been sort of increasing immigration into this country from not just Ireland, which had been traditional from the 19th century, but from the Caribbean and the Asian subcontinent. And then, at some point in the late 80s, 90s, it sort of levelled off. There was it just levelled out. And it's only since then that there's been other groups. So the fact that London is so diverse now, with people from Africa, Latin America, the whole of Europe, China, that really, it's given London a whole different feel. So that's quite a big difference, actually. So we were working in a sort of, the diversity of London was more restricted. At the time it seemed very diverse. We also had very active fascist group. National Front, and then the British National Party. The National Front, absolutely vicious group. And be fascist demonstrations and British National Party demonstrations. So racism was much rawer. It was much more in your face. So that by the time the concept of institutionalised racism came out, it was like we no longer had the sort of fighting on the streets, but we did have the sort of internalised discrimination within institutions. But the 80s were still, people were still fighting on the streets. So that does make a difference.
So you were telling me a bit about the BNP and the National Front. Were there any other antagonisms from the kind of work you were doing, and in the subcommittee and the kind of and the work they were doing? Was there any kind of conflicts, or did you hear of any conflicts with the groups that you were giving funding to?
Well, there were racist attacks going on the whole time. I can't actually think of. I'm sure there were big things going on, but because the conflict between the police and the young black male community was, in a way, that sort of. It was almost like the police were doing the work of the fascist groups for them, because they were actually doing the street fighting. Yeah, and young black men dying and so on. So, I think that was why the policing issue was so symbolic, because it actually was directly affecting people's lives. And in areas like Brixton, I mean, I don't recall any fascist activity in Brixton, but the police were operating in a racist way. Yeah.
And when you were at the GLC and you were doing the work you were doing, and there was improvements being made in terms of not just monitoring and producing information, but people making active progress in their communities on these issues. At the same time, you had a government that was pushing back and things. How did you feel about the whole situation? Did you feel that because of the GLC and because of what was happening, very optimistic, or like what was your general? Well,
it was all very optimistic it was all through the early 80s. It was all very optimistic, but Thatcher was so. I mean, the defeat of the miners actually then had repercussions throughout the left and the trade union movement. And then once she started the privatisation, the selling off of the council houses, reducing the role of local government. So the abolition of the GLC was very symbolic, but also it was beginning of an attack on local authority power. I mean, look at local authorities now. What power do they have? Whereas in the 80s, local authorities had education committees, they built housing, they had all sorts of other, they had stronger planning, rules and regulations that they could enforce. So now basically local authorities, they collect your rubbish and give you parking tickets, to be cynical about it. I mean, not just that, I mean, because we're still fighting to save libraries and so on, but at the time, I mean, we were very critical of Thatcherism at the time, but I think even with this sort of exaggeration that often goes on the left about even the scaremongering that went on, I don't think even we realised the complete effect of privatisation and the dismantling of public services over the years would have. I think you need to get something. I'll hold it.
Maybe if it goes on just a bit with the tape below it, maybe.
Okay, try that.
Okay. Yeah, you're speaking about the local councils now.
Well, it's just in terms of we might have underestimated the full impact of Thatcherism. Yeah.
And kind of looking at the political situation now, even specifically to this current context, do you feel optimistic? Some people were saying to me, for example, if we have a new Labour government under this current Labour leadership, we could have something like the GLC again, but on a bigger scale, with more funding going out.
Well, it's they've certainly got that sort of approach to seeing the virtue of how different elements of society interlock with each other. So, education, culture, all these things interlocking. And I'm very optimistic about the enthusiasm of young people for big P politics now. And because that's been missing for quite some years. And I was beginning to feel that just my generation, that our ideas would die off with us. But then when I was at your age, there were people then my age who probably were feeling the same thing, that, after 1945, Britain's never been as great as it was in 1945 for the left, So these things go in cycles as well. But there's been a long period of lack of an effective opposition. I mean, there's been things like, the camps and, climate change and so on, but they seem to, a lot of them are just fizzled out. We all felt optimistic about the Egyptian Spring and look what's happened there. So you need to have enthusiasm, but it needs to be channeled as well. You need to actually channel that enthusiasm into structures that can take power. And I think what makes me more optimistic about what's going on at the moment, even though I'm not a Labour Party member, but I can see how that enthusiasm of a younger generation for a traditional political party could then translate into a new way of doing things. I support the Progressive Alliance, so I again, this is a direct follow through from what I was talking about, sort of Gramsci and so on, which is when I looked at the election results, I saw 40 seats that could have been won by Labour, Lib Dem or Green Alliance coming together. And so my politics is for tactical voting and making alliances in order to advance things. But I don't know whether Labour is ready for that now. So are you in the Labour Party?
No. I do agree with you about tactical alliances. But if you were to kind of sit down one of these young people who you draw inspiration from, who are doing politics with the big P, like you said, if you were to kind of try and give them some lessons from the past and from the GLC, what would be the kind of key things you'd tell them?
Be as realise there's more people on our side than on their side. Therefore, to try and work with as many people as possible on your side, even if it means sometimes making compromises or having to forego your desired outcome. That's the sort of transitional approach, but that's what I'd say.
And you earlier on you mentioned about the half pint.
Oh yeah.
Battle, which is a very important battle on this list. It is big in its own right. But were you involved with that, or were you involved in any other kind of areas in the GLC that were maybe based around gender or based around arts or based around?
I was involved in women's movement politics from the 70s onwards, and what successes? I can't. Well, sometimes the successes come eventually rather than actual, cheering victories at the time.
Or even just to tell me about like what your experiences were in the being part of the women's movement at that time in the GLC. but also, as you said, you were part of it before.
And also trade unions as well.
Yeah.
So I was involved in a lot of things that didn't actually win. Well, Grunwick's, I can't remember what happened to the end of Grunwick's. I think Grunwick's, they won their jobs back. Yeah, they won their jobs back at Grunwick's. But things like that are quite, well, you know, when somebody's protesting about losing their job and they get their job back, that's pretty significant. There's less, there are few struggles like that at the moment. I think these days, with employment and the economy being what it is, people accept very often jobs going, or then get demonised. So, for example, the closure. I never thought the closure of the ticket offices on the tubes would ever go ahead. I thought, well, how can they have unstaffed stations? And yet, not only is it happening, but when there were protests about it, they just never achieved anything. So that's all very sad. So, but unless you protest, you're never going to win. So you know, and it does depend on the context, and you know, sometimes things reach a critical mass, and you know, if you just make that last push, the whole thing can then change for the better. But you don't know until you're there, you know.
And being part of the Labour movement and part of the women's movement, what did you feel there was a good relationship between the two, and between them and the GLC?
I spent a large part of my time in the Labour movement battling for women's rights, and that's still an ongoing battle, you know. And the Labour movement, of course, when I was involved in the Labour movement, it was quite racist as well, in terms of there were known examples of factories where workers managed to keep out black workers coming on board and so on, and you know, not nice things like that. Yeah. So yeah, there were. You always have to contest. So you can work as an alliance, but within that, you need to contest. You need to contest for the rights of other, you know, groups that otherwise minority groups are excluded, because otherwise they, you know, you still go. There's loads of organisations that are still just run by middle-aged white men, still, and that's that just goes to show you just need to keep pushing away at these things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just a bit of a technical question for my mind, because I think I still haven't totally grabbed with it. How did the relationship work between the kind of larger committees, and because it was quite a hierarchical. Yeah,
because there was the main GLC committee, and then I don't know whether it was called the Finance and General Purposes, but the Finance Committee was the key one, because that ultimately decides on all the spending. So this committee, the Police Committee Support Unit, was quite a small committee. So it was sort of not marginal, but all these things were add-ons. So at the time, because the main concerns were for the GLC were transport, housing, education. So all these other things, the Police Committee, the Women's Committee, the Ethnic Minorities Committee, the Culture Committee, you know, these are all optional extras, really.
Was there kind of a working relationship between the Ethnic Minorities Committee, the Women's Committee, and
we had joint we'd have joint campaigns, or we'd do joint papers on things. Yes, I would sometimes. So in the Police Committee, we developed a programme on women and policing. So obviously we then worked with the Women's Committee on that, and we had regular contact with the ethnic minorities unit as well. So there was crossover stuff going on.
Cool. And finally, was there any other reflections that you'd like to offer on the GLC?
I really hate the fact that building has become like part commercial, part trashy building. I mean, it's such a, I know I was very privileged to work in there. I had a room with a balcony overlooking the river, which, funnily enough, a neighbour of mine belongs to the gym, which is on the same floor as the floor I used to work on. So I got a free ticket to the swimming pool. And I walked along this corridor. It's exactly the same corridor, but with carpets and so on. But it's all private hotel rooms now. And I just find that area outside the GLC county was so tacky. It is, I think, is a disgrace. As a Londoner, I just feel so ashamed that that's one of our tourist top spots, this like tacky area with McDonald's and rubbish and tacky goods and horrible ice cream. I just think, I just feel so sad about that. So and people walking by just don't know what the history of that building is. I would much rather it would have become a cultural centre or museum or an arts and community centre or something like that, but that was never going to happen. Shame.
Maybe we'll see it restored to its former glory sometime soon. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for.
That's okay. Thank
for
you.
taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah.